Hello and welcome to the Media Play News Podcast. I'm your host, Charles Parkman.
And I'm co-host Charlie Sholey.
On today's episode, we'll be revisiting the writer's strike, which has just had some dramatic developments. After that, we'll be checking in on Disney's lackluster performances over this last year at the box office and how streaming may be impacting that.
Yeah, spoiler alert, the dramatic development for the writer's strike is not that the strike has concluded.
But before we get to all that, let's talk about what we watched this past week, or this past month. Sorry, I'm still adjusting to the format change.
Well, before I get into some of the highlights, I just want to shout out, we talked about the Apple Vision Pro, their headset they had announced last month, because it was brand new. And since then, chatter about it has basically flatlined. Nobody's talking about it anymore, other than dunking on the fact that, oh, this new product launch that actually hasn't launched yet, it's a total flop because Apple's only going to be producing, about 100,000 or so of these headsets. That's kind of a tired take to me.
Yeah.
First of all, it's a very, very, very niche device that has absolutely no ecosystem built out around it so far. So just people trying to get attention, and you know what? It's working because I'm talking about them now. We'll just wait and see how this thing's going to do. I'm already hearing that Apple's planning to release a more affordable one in 2025. By more affordable, it's probably going to be $2,500 instead of $3,500. But it doesn't matter. I'm not buying it. I'll get the Apple Vision Pro 3 or 4 or whatever. Or I'll just keep buying Oculus Quests. But as for what I've been watching, Black Mirror Season 6 came out. This was different from the other ones in that it actually focused a lot more on kind of horror elements than it did sci-fi. Spoiler alert, there was an entire episode which was not tech-focused at all. It was literally a werewolf kind of themed episode that took place in like the 90s too, which was like an interesting kind of stylistic choice for it. But I appreciate the novelty. Overall, it was pretty good. It wasn't the worst season ever, which I know is not really that great of an endorsement, but it's Black Mirror. If you've seen past seasons and you liked it, you'll like this. I'm still making my way through Succession. I've got a few more episodes to go, and my thoughts on it up to this point is that the acting is extremely good, and I see why people like the show in that respect. But personally, its biggest flaw is how basically none of the characters are sympathetic at all, and I'm not rooting for any of them to succeed in whatever plot is going on over the course of a season. So I know that was done intentionally, so I can't really say that's a drawback of the show. It's just an intentional choice of the writing, and I don't care what happens to the characters. I'm just watching people acting kind of like at the top of their ability. I don't really see why viewers lose their minds over the show and call it the greatest show of all time. It's just something, well executed. In general,
I think some of that is because HBO has been at the forefront of prestige television, that whatever show is the one currently on has to be the best thing ever, because otherwise it means there's nothing on.
Yeah, that could factor into it too. What else? I saw John Wick Chapter 4. I can only describe this movie as pure excess, kind of like eating 20 chocolate chip cookies in a row, where the first couple are really, really good, and then by the time you reach cookie number 10, you're sick and you don't want to have any more, but you're still only halfway through and you have to power through that. Last up, the new Wes Anderson movie Asteroid City is apparently already available to stream, or rather to rent on streaming services. So I want to check that out because it's Wes Anderson. His movies are always fun, even though I hear this one kind of sucks. But I'll reserve judgment until next time. What about you?
It's been kind of a busy month in terms of watching things, largely because my partner has not had to go out of town for work because she injured her leg while we were camping. So because she's been at home, we've been watching more stuff. Because when left alone, I will often either watch things I've already watched before or just play video games the whole time. Or spend way too much time learning how to cook a particular dish while listening to a podcast. But in this past month, I watched the movie Chevalier, which came out last year. It was a biopic about the Joseph Bologna, or Joey Bologna, as I called him the entire movie. A contemporary of Mozart, and also like personal friend of like Marie Antoinette. When during that period where things didn't go great for the upper class in France, real good. Enjoyed that movie a lot. I don't know. I knew some of his story before watching the movie, just from like music history and stuff, being like having been a traditional concert musician and taking music history classes and things like that. I like knew some of his story, but not like a ton of it. And largely because much of his story wasn't known until like the past decade or so, just because a lot of being one of the first, if not the first, black composer to gain any kind of prominence in Western Europe. And shortly after the French Revolution, Napoleon deliberately like burned many records of Joseph Bologna, and so he was just kind of almost lost to history, even though he like lived. He lived until he was in his late 50s. He died of like just a random illness. Like he survived, fighting in the French Revolution. Was like a member of like this all black platoon and everything. He was like heavily involved in that whole process. Survived. Ended up only living another 10 years after the revolution due to illness. But the movie's good. I think all the performances are really good. It's a tight 90, which I always appreciate, but like it's paced really well. And again, the performances are all great. It's a very like tight cast, and everyone does a good job. I've also watched.
Well, real quick, what's not a tight cast is the cast of Independence Day, which we just had July 4th, so of course I had to watch Independence Day. There are too many characters in that movie.
There's like 5 plots in Independence Day. It's excessive.
Yeah, and it sort of comes together at the end, but not really that well executed. But whatever. It's a movie to watch because of a certain day of the year, not because I want to watch that movie.
Right. No one's like clamoring for just like, oh man, a movie I haven't seen in a while? Independence Day. You're like, oh, it's the 4th of July. There's a movie called that.
Yeah, I just want to watch it for the build-up to the speech where the president says, "Today we celebrate our Independence Day."
That was the first.
And then I jump off the couch and I clap and applaud and yell, "Yeah, America!"
Fun fact, that was the first thing they all shot together. That was the first scene of the film that all of the principal cast was present for. And Will Smith reportedly insisted on not having his stand-in do it because they're standing out in the desert, and Will Smith's like, we should be there. So he like didn't have his stand-in that, even though you mostly see the back of his head, because you can just get that in, you can catch those reaction shots later. You don't have to stand there for the whole speech. It was like, well, we're doing this together. This is also like his second movie, so he was.
Oh, okay. So of course he's going to be super pumped to just be there with everybody else, especially if it's the start of the shoot.
Yeah, he's coming fresh off, The Fresh Prince, and which was still airing airing and recording at the time. And he had been in one other movie before then, and he was just like, yeah, it's hot, but like we're doing this. And so he went out, and everyone else like reluctantly also joined this 26-year-old who's just excited about being involved. But I also watched. I hope I didn't mention this last time because I'm still thinking about it. I watched. No, I definitely talked about it last time. Never mind. Cut this out, future me. I've been watching, and I'll talk more about it when we get later into the show, but I've been catching up on some stuff, and I've been watching Pushing Daisies, which was on, I forget what network it was on. It may have been NBC, like 15 years ago. But it stars Lee Pace and a bunch of other people that you would recognize if you saw them, but probably not by their name.
You know, more and more often I'm thinking about things that I realize are 15 years old or older.
Yeah. It came out in 2007.
Yeah.
It had 2 seasons. The first season was 8 episodes. The second season is 13. And it's good. It was... The premise of Pushing Daisies is the lead character, the pie maker. He has a name, but narratively, like in the narrative, they often refer to him as the pie maker. There is a omniscient narrator that I haven't finished it yet, so I don't know if the narrator comes up as a character, as happens sometimes. But the pie maker has the ability to bring the dead back to life, but by touching them. And if he touches someone or something that is dead, it comes back to life. And if it stays alive for more than 1 minute, another life is forfeit. So he discovers this by his mom dies, with like a heart attack or something in their kitchen, while he's there alone with her, and he touches her and she comes back to life. And doesn't realize that she's died. Just comes back right away. And across the street, his best friend's dad is, watering the lawn, and he falls dead after a minute. The pie maker doesn't know. His name's Ned. Ned doesn't know that this happens. Doesn't make the correlation. A couple hours later, his mom's putting him to bed, kisses him on the forehead, immediately returns to death. And so him and his best friend named Chuck, the little girl who lives across the street, both their lives fall apart. His dad drops him off at a boarding school. Her mom died during childbirth. So they're both end up never seeing each other again. Until 20 years later, when she is strangled on a cruise ship. And at this point, he has been found out by a local private detective, witnesses him use this ability by accident, and then convinces him to help him solve murders by bringing the murder victim back to life and asking them about the details of their murder. It's a novel concept. The show is weird. It has it almost feels like a stage play. The sets are relatively simple. There aren't a ton of sets, and they use a lot of CG that looks flat on purpose. It's really enjoyable. It's all on Max, but I've been catching up on that. I'm 3 episodes from the end, and while the first season is enjoyable, the second season really ramps up with now that everything's been set up, you understand all the characters. It really grabs you. So we've been rushing through that for the last week or two. And then aside from that, most recently I've seen both The Flash, which I don't know, maybe we'll talk about later, when we're talking about box office.
Yeah.
And The Little Mermaid, which we'll definitely talk about because that segment is about Disney specifically. And honestly, they're both fine. I liked The Little Mermaid more than I thought I was going to. I think it's an improvement on the original film in ways that I think matter, and then it is for reasons that are obvious as soon as you start to think about them, are worse. Because you can't have fish emote. if you make them realistic. Flounder is terrifying, and he's really largely written out of the movie. Like, he's barely there because they realized how creepy and gross he was to look at. And Daveed Diggs voices Sebastian, and his Jamaican accent is cartoonish, and it doesn't help how hard it is to watch a crab talk. But in terms of the narrative and the other visual effects, like the physicality of the mermaids and Ursula in particular, and the performances are all relatively solid. It's better than I expected it to be. And I can say the same about The Flash, but I've had more time to think about The Flash, and so we'll get into it later on.
Yeah, I rely on you for all the superhero movie takes, because as, again, we'll get into when we talk about this stuff later in the show, I don't watch any of this stuff.
And I don't know, we'll see what happens to that whole industry, depending on what's going on with our first story. But first, our inspiration this week is we are still working through Charlie's wedding alcohol.
That's right. We're having more Ballast Point today.
Yep, we're starting off with Sculpin, and then we got some, which one's it? The Speedboat. They're Lime Blonde Ale. So we're getting there.
We're cruising.
Charlie just has to have me over more often so I can drink his alcohol. It'll go away really quickly.
Please help.
I only live 5 minutes away. It's a cheap Uber. But
we'll talk about that after the show.
Let's get into the stories. Just this last week, the Screen Actors Guild and American Federation of Television and Radio Artists voted to strike alongside the Writers Guild, the first time writers and actors have engaged in simultaneous strikes since 1960. I'm leaving it in. Among the actors' demands are higher compensation that the studios have been unwilling to negotiate for, better benefits, and safeguards against the use of artificial intelligence. Allegedly, actors have been offered around a day's pay for their likeness to be scanned and rendered using AI in perpetuity. On the studio side, Disney CEO Bob Iger said in an interview, "We've talked about disruptive forces on this business and all the challenges we're facing, the recovery from COVID, which is ongoing. It's not completely back. This is the worst time in the world to add to that disruption."
You know what I say to that? Boo-hoo.
Bob Iger gave that quote at a billionaire's retreat. That David Zaslav and Mark Zuckerberg were also at. He also just signed his own contract that extended his contract for 2 more years. And while Bob Iger is on the lower end of streaming network CEOs, I mean, Disney is obviously much larger than their streaming arm, but he's on the lower end of these CEOs that are involved in this negotiation. He still makes $26 million a year base salary without bonuses. So I don't know. It's very interesting to be like, we gotta think about how the industry's going, what's being disrupted. People can't pay their bills.
Yeah, it's a real thing. I think that movies, especially the stuff Disney's been putting out with like Marvel and Star Wars and whatnot, that their budgets have just gotten so big, and just in news articles coming out in how heavily these movies rely on CG and how hard Disney rides the contract studios that produce these effects.
Yeah.
That they're producing too much stuff with too short a time window for them to do that good of a job.
Yeah, and it's showing and it comes up.
Yeah. People are really noticing it, and it's just hurting the brand in general. And a lot of this is going to bleed over to the next thing we're going to be talking about too, with Disney's movies kind of underperforming expectations.
Yeah. There's a lot of interesting elements to this, because these unions, the unions that are currently on strike, like the DGA, the Directors Guild, negotiated about a week or two before the WGA strike happened. So the Directors Guild reached a satisfactory to enough of them conclusion. So that they're still going. But with the addition of of SAG-AFTRA also joining the strike, and what that includes is promotion even. So like actors who have projects releasing, like a project that just started on Adult Swim and Max, like from Warner Brothers, was My Adventures with Superman, the first new animated superhero or a Superman specific series since 1997's Superman the Animated Series. Just started. It's been out for 2 weeks, and Jack Quaid, who's also plays Huey on The Boys, and like the other cast members, can no longer promote that show. They can't mention it in any of their social media. They can't like go on interviews and talk about it. Like, and that's happening across the board. That's part of the strike conditions, is we're not doing any promo. Just Saturday night, The Haunted Mansion premiered. None of the actors, because the strike got announced on Friday as of recording, the SAG-AFTRA initiated their strike Friday. So Saturday, none of the actors were at the premiere, which was at Disneyland. The director was able to be there, but couldn't give any interviews because he's also a writer. He's credited on the screenplay. So as a director, he's permitted to like be there, but he can't give any press because of his role as a writer. So this is already having like immediate impacts, and it's good because the point of strikes is to be disruptive. They're supposed to make it hard for the rest of the industry.
Yeah, Bob Iger had his quote saying this couldn't have come at a more disruptive time, but that is the absolute best time.
Literally the point.
For the aggrieved parties to engage in their strike.
Yeah.
And, you could kind of make light of it and say, well, it doesn't really matter because all the talk shows that the mega stars are going to promote their stuff on are also currently not filming because of said writer's strike. Right. This is really going to hurt the lower public profile actors way more than it will the household names that people know already.
Right. And like that's a thing that I have been glad to see on social media is those higher profile actors who honestly can weather this no problem, being very vocal about their support and what this means for the industry as a whole and what it means going forward beyond themselves. Like as a SAG-AFTRA member, you have to make a cumulative $26,000 a year in union jobs to qualify for their health benefits. 87% of union members didn't reach that threshold last year. $26,000 a year, that's the equivalent of like $15 an hour working full time. That's nothing. That's so little. And yet 87% of people who are a member of this union didn't qualify because the day rates stay low and residuals aren't being shared at the rate that they were 10, 15, 20 years ago, where like you could be like professional background, like a professional like extra, and make a living because your rate increases. And this is still the case, but like it hasn't scaled to cost of living. Like as a paid background extra, you get paid one rate. Like there's one rate for like just being in the background of a scene. There's another rate for being costumed. There's another rate for having a speaking role. There's another rate for being a named extra with a speaking role. Like there's tiers to like, how that approaches, and then there are residuals that come along with that. But those are all, to my understanding, are negotiated for broadcast. And streaming doesn't have those same things locked in. And that's one of the big things one of the major points being made right now is that streaming is where people are consuming their content. And that's where the money is going. So there should be a reassessment of how the industry pays every element of its workers to reflect how it's changed. And so it's Now that, actors are striking as well, I think there's like a lot more negotiating power. And what I hope happens, and actually this is the point I was trying to get to, but what I hope happens is that VFX artists who are not unionized typically, those studios tend to just kind of grab contracts wherever they can. And like you said, they often don't get enough time to like really refine stuff, or they get so many notes that like they're changing things last minute. That was like Disney in particular.
Yeah, the deadlines are just set outside of their control.
Right.
I actually just read some story about the studio that was doing the VFX for Sonic and Cats. Apparently because those movies were under like such negative scrutiny, kind of like pre-release.
Yeah.
They were bringing on VFX artists without even interviewing them, just to say, we need bodies like in front of computers to get all of these VFX done before we release the movie.
Well, like you watch the credits of, especially like Marvel movies, because they encourage you to, they've programmed us to stay, but you see,
not me,
and
I walk out immediately.
I do now look up, like while I'm sitting in the theater, blank movie post-credit scenes, and just like see what they are to decide if it's worth staying now. Because I'm like, I've already been here for 2.5 hours. What if I don't need to be here for another 15 minutes? I won't be. But you're sitting and you're watching the credits, and there's 5 VFX studios because they put dates on a calendar 5 years ago and are unwilling to adjust them. Like if COVID hadn't happened, who knows? Like if any of those movies would have been adjusted at all, regardless of like what the production schedule was. But one of the things that impacts VFX artists, and like one of the reasons that they aren't able to unionize as effectively, and one of the things that is starting to impact the writers and actors, the writers because it's been almost 2 months, but it's definitely also going to start affecting actors, is international studios are often not in a position to also not work in solidarity with the American unions. So at the towards the beginning of the writer strike, there were studios that were like reaching out to non-unionized writers and even some union writers to go to the UK or Australia to write there, because then they technically wouldn't be, scabbing because they're in another region, but like you're still scabbing, like you're still doing that. And Netflix, even before all this, was already heavily investing in international projects, like a lot of stuff in India and South Korea. A lot of things are filmed in New Zealand and Australia and Canada, areas where those production, because they have a different setup within their country, they're not in the same position necessarily to also strike or like turn down work because the American productions are being shut down by the strikes. And it creates like an interesting dynamic. But VFX artists in particular, because there are so many studios around the world of varying sizes that do VFX that are already having like work outsourced to them, American VFX artists have had difficulty organizing in any significant way. But I think now, with both writers and actors not working, and like the Teamsters union refusing to cross picket lines, so if like you can get to a set before it starts, the Teamsters aren't going to cross the picket line, and so that production can't happen. That's happening like all over. It's happening in California and Georgia, Florida and Texas and New York, like all over the place, and everywhere where like there are large productions that we know happen. Again, because if you watch the credits of anything, you can see like that Big Peach is like, like Georgia has really good tax benefits for film and television production. So a lot of things are filmed there. A lot of things are filmed in Hawaii. So like people who were like in those areas are like, as soon as they find out about a thing, they're going to move their picketing there, because the Teamsters are, while the Teamsters are not striking and will do their job to the best of their ability, they won't cross picket lines. So if there's a picket line where they're going, they'll stop in solidarity. But not everyone has that opportunity. So I hope with as much shutdown as there is, that VFX artists are able to get in on that collective action.
Yeah, and I think they should. Obviously, it's disruptive to us consumers who just want to watch new movies all the time.
Yeah.
And streaming is definitely, if not a superior alternative to going out to theaters to watching stuff. So many people watch Netflix to the point where if you see like, bandwidth usage over time, it's like 5 p.m. to 9 p.m. It just spikes straight into the sky because everyone comes home from work and they just turn on the TV.
Yep.
And they're watching streaming services now, not cable. The way that those services have to pay the people that make that stuff, like you said, just hasn't caught up to the times with it.
Yeah.
I prefer TV shows that are just like 10 episodes long rather than like 20 plus episodes like they used to be in the cable days. Mm-hmm. But, there has to be some sort of way that the people producing all that stuff get compensated in like a comparable way.
Yeah. And I mean, it's not like that was necessarily always the model. Like, there are a number of shows like, Better Off Ted, which is a show that I did thoroughly enjoy around the same time. By Pushing Daisies, like I was talking about earlier, its first season, it was on NBC. Its first season was only 8 episodes long, and it got a second season. But I imagine its contract was reflective of other shows that were on that same network at the same time. And so it's like not even like it has, Pushing Daisies has less than 24 episodes total, like compared to something like, like Scrubs, which got a 24 episode order out the gate for its one season.
Yeah. You remember back in the day when seasons of shows would have their mid-season break through like November and December.
You just don't get to watch new episodes until January or February, and then they push all of them week to week, and then June rolls around and you just have to hang out and watch that whole season again over the summer. But like the BBC, in the UK, how many BBC shows have more than 8 episodes a season?
Seriously, they have like 3 episodes a season.
What was it? The BBC Sherlock is like 12 episodes total. Like it's something crazy like that over 4 series, not seasons. But it just needs to adjust. But getting to like some of the kind of higher profile like parts of it, like AI being a thing. From what I've read, those like AI proposals for like using an actor's license like in perpetuity or whatever like threshold of time they were using, that was largely for background actors. So it's like it's not your stars of Grey's Anatomy and just like that, but it's like people who are in the background and would normally be getting these day rates for every day that they're on set. What would be happening?
I guess those studios aren't aware of the fact that also using AI, you can generate completely unique faces. Why don't they just do that?
It's both like an overestimation of what the technology can do and an underestimation of what the technology can do.
Yeah, like with writers saying you can't use AI to write scripts for us, and executive producers saying, why don't we just generate 10 ideas? Like, well, they're all going to be pretty bland.
Right, and they're all going to be at best derivative of other ideas based on what that model is trained on. And like it's going to be the same thing as like all these college and high school kids who are getting busted for using ChatGPT and stuff to write their essays and not changing anything. It's to like make it into an actual voice because the technology's not there yet. But the thing with that, in terms of using background actors like likeness, is one, you never know kind of what any one person's trajectory is going to be, and two, it doesn't. That continues to take even if, like I said, people used to be able to be like professional background actors. Like that was just their whole. They very rarely, if ever, had like speaking or named roles, but you were doing enough work that like in a combination with your day, your day rates and also like your residuals, you could do okay for yourself. But it takes, if like you get a day or a week's worth of pay, even, and now your likeness is being used, then that's work that you don't get in the future.
Yeah, or I'll give like a counterpoint to that. I don't necessarily think that job is entitled to be around forever anyway. If you just think about technology being more broadly adopted, not just for movie and TV production, but just society in general.
Yeah.
If you think about like telephone operators like physically moving switches around to connect calls, like there's no reason that job role had to stay around just for the sake of keeping those people employed. Now, I'm not saying that replacing background extras with AI generated figures is any good. It's probably not going to be good for at least like 10 more years to have like the fine-grained control that a director would need to make sure that things stay consistent from shot to shot.
The purpose of, background extras is largely just like to get so that the world feels full. And if you're not being focused on anyway, why couldn't that be that is a valid point. I just think that the technology's not there yet, and so
it's definitely not. I mean, there was a big uproar in one of Disney's latest Marvel show releases, Secret Invasion, because they used AI art generation to kind of facilitate the intro sequence, and it did not look very good.
It does not look good.
It looks consistent with the type of stuff that I'll usually see with those types of tools, because I've messed around with it a fair amount myself, and you can get some very good stuff with it. I'm just surprised that Disney kind of like gave the thumbs up on whatever the result was, the studio they contracted to make it, because they should have just said, all right, we're going to eat this cost and spend another like $1 million to have a person do this.
Right. Or even like have it be guided a little bit, because what it seems like is it was very hands off. So like for comparison, all of the Disney Plus shows have a kind of like a largely like digital visual like intro. Almost none of them are here's shots of the actors doing things. Actually, none of them are. Not a single one of them is here's the actors doing a thing. Or like even like clips from the show you're about to watch. They're all like here's some computer generated visuals that we're gonna like shift around. And like with the Secret Invasion intro, I see what they're going for. And I think with like a guiding hand, in addition to these AI tools, you can create something that like gives that impression of like this unease of like, is that a person? Secret Invasion is about Skrulls, which were featured prominently in Captain Marvel. They're shape-shifting aliens that can like look like anybody. And so like the whole idea, and the reason Secret Invasion is also like centered around Nick Fury, the big spy of the Marvel Universe. So like the idea of shapeshifters and espionage and like having this kind of uncanny element to it could work, and it's clearly what they're going for. But like it looks kind of sloppy still. I think if they had used AI tools, which most people who work in fields that are being like impeded on by to these different AI tools are like, these are great as tools and can be shaped by someone who has like a vision to like help it, as like an element. This is another thing in the toolbox, right? So thinking back to like the Daredevil intro, which is like incredible, of like this wax dripping effect over various things, could probably, something similar could be accomplished using these AI tools. That was 10 years ago. Who knows what, what else you could do now using those tools, but like with a deliberate vision. But like the fact that they didn't do that and it looks kind of rough is a bummer.
Was Daredevil really 10 years
ago? It was right after their first Avengers. It was 2013, 2014. Moving away from specifically the strike and more into the, where film is in general, looking specifically at Disney. Several of its recent theatrical releases haven't met expectations, with Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny being the most recent example. Its other three underperforming films include Ant-Man and the Wasp: Quantumania, Elemental, and The Little Mermaid. It's looking likely that Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 will be its highest-grossing film at $835 million, marking the first time since 2014 that Disney didn't field a billion-dollar movie, excluding the COVID years, of course. Other factors contributing to this trend include moviegoers being conditioned to expect fast releases on Disney+, increased costs due to COVID-related delays, and inflated budgets. On average, a Disney movie requires upwards of $200 million to shoot, with an additional $100 million to market.
So yeah, this is just more jabs and right hooks against Disney putting their movies out. Not only are they apparently underpaying their actors and writers, but the movies themselves are not grossing the same amount that,
right,
the studio itself has kind of been conditioned to think. Just thinking about, Marvel movies from 5 to 10 years ago, pretty much every single one coming out was like, if it didn't make $1 billion, that was kind of like a head scratcher, because for the most part, they were just printing money, no matter what they were making.
Yeah, from the first Avengers breaking $1 billion domestically, it just kind of continued on that.
Yeah, I mean, not even just on top of that, but the speed at which they made money too.
Yeah,
I think both the Infinity War movies
within a week.
Yeah, exactly. And now it seems that that trend is stopping. Just from like my anecdotal view into the few recent Marvel movies I've seen, it just feels like the quality of the movies themselves are nowhere near what they used to be.
Yeah, there's definitely been a shift. So like the thing with, and we've talked about the Marvel movies before, but the things with phases 1 and 2. Phase 1 was, aside from Iron Man 2, which like even Iron Man 2 only kind of, it has some elements that push it into franchise building, but does try to tell its own story. But like those Phase 1 movies are all telling individual stories and are tangentially like connected to each other and all kind of have a similar end point that leads them into Avengers. And Avengers being as successful as it was came down to that momentum being built of like, oh, all 5 of these movies are at least good, if not great. Like Iron Man and Captain America being the standouts in those first 5, and then Avengers hitting really hard. Phase 2 had more movies in it, but did also like try to continue that trend of like, we're continuing from where we left off, both in the solo movies and the Avengers, and continuing to tell individualized stories as well as introduce new characters to bring us, up to Phase 3. And it seems like since the second Avengers, for the most part, a lot of the Marvel projects seem more interested in the idea of this interconnected universe than it does in the stories, and that's what's starting to like not pay off in the same way since Endgame, which could have been a conclusive ending for this entire thing, and then we just like
right, but that's not how businesses work. I understand why they made more, but from like a story point of view, that was like the pinnacle of all the movies up to that point.
Yeah, it has seemed like there's been a lot of emphasis on just releasing projects, both in theaters and in Disney Plus, which, like, you know, when Bob Iger came back on as CEO, was like, we've been doing too much. And he was right. And it's a bad time to agree with Bob Iger, but he was correct. There was across Disney's franchises, there were so many projects being released that they couldn't have not been cannibalizing each other across, because they're all effectively family franchises.
Yeah, and what I just realized, and what's kind of funny, Netflix is also producing a ton of their own stuff, probably a lot more than what Disney's making.
Oh yeah.
And it really doesn't feel like, Netflix is making too much stuff and diluting their brand.
I think their market is more diverse.
Yeah,
is a big
I think that's
part
exactly
of
it.
Because Star Wars is effectively for families. Even if you watch Kenobi and Andor and The Mandalorian, which have a more serious tone, they never get past a point where you're like, well, I can't have my 10-year-old watch this. Which
not true arts
was that, and Star Wars is not as Star Wars and Marvel are not as gendered in their marketing as they used to be, even 5-10 years ago. So they do have a broad appeal to multiple age groups, and without any particular gender bias in terms of how they're marketed, at least in terms of the actual product itself, not necessarily other things tie-in products and things like that. The Little Mermaid wasn't this is the movie to take your little girls to. It was just hey, this Disney classic that everyone loves, we're doing another one of them. The Marvel movies are they're all PG-13, but it's usually just because
there's violence in it,
and it's consequence-free violence too.
Everyone's smiling while they're fighting. That's not real violence.
No one's ever bleeding, really. If anyone dies, you don't see it, unless their death is relevant to the story, and especially in those cases, you don't actually see them being grievously harmed. They're usually just knocked mostly unconscious, and then they close their eyes. Even Doctor Strange and the Multiverse of Madness is probably the most out there in terms of how visually intense it is in terms of the violence.
Yeah, and even then, it's just shocking for a Marvel movie.
Right,
it's not really
it's relative
shocking objectively
to other ones of those. And even The Little Mermaid, which in the animated original film ends with Ursula being giant. Spoilers for a 33-year-old movie. Ends with Ursula, who is giant because magic, being run through with a galleon. That still happens in the live action film, but you don't see it. You see it about to happen, and it cuts away, and then she's dying.
There's a reason the trope Disney death is a thing.
I mean, they used to be pretty intense. As recently as 2000, the bad guy in Tarzan, you see his lifeless body swinging from vines.
Oh, yeah.
You see the shadow of his lifeless body while he's frantically cutting around him, and you see right before but you do still see his lifeless body. But yeah, I think a big part of Disney's problem is an oversaturation of the market that eats into its own audience, but also a lot of them, Marvel movies in particular, and some of the Star Wars stuff, because of how they're handling a lot of their CG. Their VFX artists, and the demands they're placing, a lot of it doesn't hold up. Some of it looks pretty rough. I will say, The Little Mermaid, one of the biggest things it had going for it is, despite insisting on keeping all of the animals very realistic, a lot of the CG elements look very good. A lot of the animals that don't have, we're not looking at their face. Like, they move very well. Like, how Ursula's octopus half moves around is like a very specific, particular like physicality, and it looks good. But like, that's one of the few movies like across studios, one of the few CG heavy movies that I've seen in the last like year and a half that doesn't have anything that looks super rough because it was maybe rushed or they didn't have time to smooth out the textures. Like, I saw The Flash, and The Flash has been catching a lot of flack because of how its visuals look. And there's, the director was like, hey, this visual style was like a deliberate choice. Like, we're doing this for like a reason. And that makes sense for one particular like type of shot that's like repeated throughout the movie, that it looks a certain way, but it doesn't excuse the stuff that's not. Like, there's a particular visual storytelling device that they use in regards to the time travel. That's not a spoiler. It's a big part of all the marketing is time travel's happening. So
nobody saw it anyway, according to the box office figures.
But like, the visual that they use to like signify time travel has a very particular look that's like deliberately like emulating a film reel. And so the way it looks is not super clean, but like in a way that I think makes sense and kind of works for what the visual they're going for.
Right. It's one of those things where when the screen looks like this, you know what's happening without people having to tell you what's happening.
Yeah. But there are other shots that don't have that excuse. Like, there's not using it's not visual storytelling for the character to look rubbery when they're standing still because they're wearing a physical costume. Like, there are things like that like you don't get. Like, the MCU's been guilty of that, like in particular with helmets and like face masks, where they're like, we're gonna put some dots on you and we're gonna CG it over because the character, because we're paying you a bunch of money, you're gonna show your face a whole bunch. So I think there's certainly merit to, we gotta slow down on these. Like, we shouldn't be pushing across studios, just pushing these very visual effects heavy films out without giving them the time that they need to like polish those visual effects. But I also, like, on the other side of that, like, I don't want to go on too long about it because this is already a long episode. But the other side of that is like, what's considered a bomb, like, feels insane to me.
Oh yeah, it still makes hundreds of millions of dollars. And I guess, even if it breaks even, they consider it a bomb because it's as simple as, well, we could have made something else that made a profit. So this was the wrong thing to allocate our capital on.
But it's like, you can't have it both ways. You can't both be like, well, we're going to just kind of push this thing through and not examine the reasons that movies that were making $1 billion in a week or two were doing that. Infinity War on its own wouldn't have made $1 billion if it hadn't been the culmination of 18 movies up to that point. Like, it didn't happen in a vacuum. And I feel like that's like a lesson that,
I mean, all the other non-Disney studios that tried to make their own Avengers level movie as like the second or even first movie of their franchise
all failed immediately.
Yeah, for good reason. You don't have kind of like the popularity and the structure supporting it for it to succeed.
Like, the Dark Universe flopped after one because like they were like, hey, we're going to do a whole thing, and we announced it before the first movie's even out. DC got scared after Man of Steel came out the year after Avengers. So they had like a fairly, like, Man of Steel did well. Like, there was a lot of discussion around it. It was received very like mixed, but did really well financially. And then Civil War was supposed to be coming out, and I feel like DC maybe like got scared that Marvel was going to beat them to the punch with like another thing, and we're like, well, we got to push Batman and Wonder Woman, both of them, into this thing at the same time. It's effectively a Superman sequel, but not really, because we had to introduce two new prominent characters at the same time. And then instead of like pacing out the solo movies the way that Marvel did. DC's like, well, the next thing's going to be Justice League, and then we'll sort it out afterwards. And it didn't work for like a number of reasons. COVID, creative differences, like with directors, eventually like more than one actor having issues with the studio in one case and the public at large in the other. But like, to get back to the other point, The Flash made $200 million that first weekend. That's a lot of money.
Yeah.
But it was like, this is a flop.
Still considered not good, which I cannot wrap my head around.
Yeah, it's hard to kind of like accept that idea. But like, and from the ground level, that's obviously a lot of money, especially considering that you can watch stuff from home. Like, I was just this past weekend hanging out with a friend who he and his wife have not been to a theater since 2019. They were like pretty conscious about like, COVID safety and stuff. And even as things have opened up, even as they've started to do other things, like we were at a Pride Parade. We were like surrounded by people. But after not going to the theater for a while, people get used to, oh, well, this is going to be either on streaming or I'll be able to rent it or buy it digitally within 6-7 weeks, sometimes less of a thing coming out. So like the market has shifted, and I don't think the industry is keeping up with what that means in a number of ways, which is how we circle back to the beginning of the show, are having a strike right now. Like there's like, I think at that high level, they don't have the perspective to be like, tastes have changed and like how people are consuming stuff is changing in a way where success isn't going to look like it used to for a number of reasons, at least for a while. Maybe 5-6 years from now, the box office will like bounce back and people will be, more open to seeing stuff, especially if the visuals get tightened up. Like, I think I talked about this early on in the show where I was like, Godzilla King of Monsters was one of my favorite movies that I saw in theaters in like 2017 or 2019. And then Godzilla vs. Kong is not a good movie for a number of reasons, but a big part of why it didn't hit me as hard is because I had to watch it on my 60-inch screen at home instead of on a 60-foot screen in a movie theater with surround sound. Like, there's an element of spectacle that you get even in things that aren't like visually arresting or like, special effects heavy. There's like an element to seeing a movie in a theater that does grab a lot of people.
Yeah, and just speaking to that, we've got the next Christopher Nolan movie coming out at the end of this week, Oppenheimer, and he's famous for doing as much stuff practically as he can. So perhaps if this movie blows up, wink, wink.
Oh, what are you, a writer now?
Hey, those studios will take what they can get now. Anyway, if that movie does exceptionally well, then all it takes is a couple successes outside of sort of the norm that studios kind of like expect. Just like how Blair Witch kicked off found footage movies. You can make a movie for $1 million and it makes $100 million.
Right. And like even like horror movies, I think, kind of get overlooked despite consistently proving that. Like, there's a horror movie that just came out.
Insidious, The Red Door.
Well, that one did also just come out, but
that's the only one I'm aware of that's come out. I don't follow horror news. I won't see any of them. I am too scared.
The Blackening, the horror movie based around like, it's a group of, black friends and they're all out and like horror movie stuff starts happening. And like the tagline for that movie was like, we can't all be the first one. It's like the trope of, the black person in the cast being the first person to die. That movie made $17 million its opening weekend on a $5 million budget. So like, that's over triple its budget, not including, marketing and stuff, presumably. It's always, we generally don't get to find that out until later if the studio decides to disclose that anyway. But like, that is a pretty consistent thing with, I wanted to use the Blackening as an example because it just came out and is an example of that, of like low budget with like a high return. But because they're effectively using the budget that they have rather than what a lot of larger studios do, where Disney is like, Marvel is especially guilty of this, of like taking a director who's used to one scale of movies and then throwing a bunch of money at them and being like, well, make that exact same level of success, scale up, because all it takes is throwing money at it.
Yeah, I mean, the last point that I'll give on this is directly relevant to that point. It was some tweet I saw that was like, instead of Disney spending $200 million on a single movie, give $20 million to 10 promising directors, and you'll probably have a way better outcome than that.
Well, hopefully, studios learn a number of lessons relatively soon, so that this industry that no one wants to see do poorly, everyone loves their media. We all want our TV and movies to be good and keep happening. That's all any of us want. So we'll see how that develops. But that's going to wrap us up for this month. You can find links to these articles in the show notes and at MediaPlayNews.com, and you can subscribe to the site's mailing list using the subscription link in the notes. You can email us directly at MediaPlayNewsPodcast@gmail.com to have your comment featured on the show. If you like the show, leave us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to podcasts. We really appreciate it. I'm Charles Parkman.
I'm Charlie Sholey.
And we will see you next month.